Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John. This report is for the 26th of August. And, well, we hit that resistance. We kept talking about it. That was the marker at the 32. We also knew that the 2923 had to hold as well, given that we were in a, weakening condition and we were looking for steel to dip below. Cyan would do it, and it happened early on. We saw it develop on the 5K, then represented on the 50K, and then things fell off the cliff with the whole China and added tariffs and the fight with the Fed. So it's all coming to a head, but we're still within the exact same range we have been. So there's been nothing that dramatic, even though it seems dramatic. When everyone's running for the exits, it's always these big bars, and then you get this slow uptick, bar by bar. NASDAQ, literally identical. That gave the euro a huge boost, which is what he is trying to do, because he really wants to weaken the dollar a bit because he thinks it's too strong, and they were very concerned about this, and this is something we were talking about. What was going to happen to help drive this back up, because there was just a growing concern about the EU prospects, and a dive of the euro would have made things much tougher for the US. So this gave the impetus to drive things right back up. So it's all working as they hoped. And oil taking a dip because they think that this is going to maybe potentially have some longer term implications for the general health of economic growth, which certainly would mean an oil glut. We're not experiencing it yet. We're still within the same range, but there's potential that that could drop off more. We have dipped below the red line already, so we're looking to potentially make lower lows than we've already got right here. And of course, as I've said before, gold is going to be the return. I think he even had Jackson Hole, Bank of England member talking about the idea of, alternative cryptocurrency as the new, base currency for the world as opposed to the dollar. So it's all this idea of trying to get the dollar out of reserve currency status and either form some type of crypto that's an international or whatever. But this is something that's been talked about for some time. They're really trying to push that because they really want to move the global economy to electronic cryptocurrencies and remove cash, giving them much greater control over people's existence. It's not a conspiracy, it's just what they're doing. You can refer to whatever you want, but it's an ideal situation for them because, and two, it does give the opportunity for the U.S. to then devalue its debt, which would be the optimal situation given the amount of borrowing, because then you could hyperinflate your way out of it, much like happened in the 70s when inflation went crazy and it just sort of took care of budget deficits from the Vietnam era, blah, 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 blah. But that's too much for what we're looking at right now. We're just looking at our 5K. So we had started out reaching up to that peak, and again, we had the 23. Actually, I should even put a line at the 23 because it's something we've talked about for some time. And we always like to make those the magenta color. And you can see that every time we break below it, you get a little bit more follow through, and of course all it does is dip back down to the 2905, which was another previous, and so we ended up with a series of okay pivots. But the problem with all of these was finding, and because of the no steel reset, you know that the likelihood of these making significant moves is limited until you get like a situation here where you end up with the steel moving back below red, even though red was all the way up near zero. But that just created a nice DOC spread, and when you have that reset, those DOC spreads tend to produce a little bit better result. This came all the way back down to the 23, but then you had the rising gold that sort of gave it the support that it needed, and then higher pivot again off of DOC red. And that actually produced cyan under red, which was very bullish. So then we get into this peak where you have cyan under red, but then you end up with the beautiful DOC spread right there, still below 15. So even at this peak point, right at the resistance, you're getting a short signal that looks pretty good. Now, in this case, you're watching for, the potential of green over cyan. Doesn't happen. and you get another rejection of the green to cyan situation with the spike of orange, and that led to a cascade that broke the lows. And then by the time you ended up with this orange setup right here, you had the meeting of the cyan and green, and it was rejected. And it took a few bars for it to actually fully reject, but by the time you were here, you had the full rejection of it. So even if you had thought about covering to go long, it was an opportunity to reinitiate at that particular point. And I had no objections to some of these buy signals that came like right here. This was decent. It just, you got the crossover, but then boom, immediately rejects right as you get over the 23, and that's usually something that you expect to make it to the 38 plus or higher percentage. Let me just increase the size of this so it's a little bit easier to see. There we go. Slide it across. And that's kind of what I look for, and usually this is what I was talking about. When you're above that plus 13.5 and then it dips down, right about there is where you're looking for it to catch some significant fire. It doesn't do it, and then the steel dips below. That's the sort of secondary cursor, and you kind of get a little bit of flattening with the steel coming back above, but you didn't get any orange dip, and that's what led to the move to the 2870 after having broken the 2880. And it's amazing how you get these little flat areas right at these key algo points. They're not coincidental, though. They really don't have Fibonacci correlation from the broader standpoint. It's just that's where previous activity has taken place, and boom, these are positive extremes that were set up from the beginning of all these runs, and it's just filling them back in. Well, that leaves the next one all the way down to the 47 level, and you can see that we just continued that cascade. There was an attempted reset right about here that really just didn't do anything because you had no orange cascade below. So every one of these little pop attempts were just opportunities to either add into a short, or if you wanted to take a run, I usually expect that I'm not going to get much more than the 38%. In these cases, they hit the 50 and then started to reject every time the cyan green met. This one actually had a pretty strong return right here, and then 2 bars, boom. I mean, nothing you can do about that kind of situation, but once you're there, you know, hey, this is going to continue lower. It's just a matter of waiting for it, and that's exactly what happened until we produced this setup right here, which was also pretty decent, and that led to the bigger carry through to the end of the day. We had even cyan moving below, but just as we were getting close to the end there, we ended up with the DOC spread rejecting off that pretty quick. Though this one is probably likely to still bounce back up a little bit because it doesn't have the steel coming from above and down below, but having been down below. So it's like a full reset off of rising gold. So I'm expecting that potentially at the start of future open, we'll probably get a little bit more of a bounce. And that assumes that you don't get more decay and conversation about tariffs, blah, 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 blah. But that's just the general read. If we look at it from the 50K standpoint, too, it also gives us a broader perspective on it. You can see there's been a little bit of a turnaround there. You've got just the configurations that you need. Though you have an extreme steel move, you also have an extreme of red DOC where you're below 20, and that usually creates a little bit of a pop. They don't tend to sustain themselves very long, so we're not expecting that this is going to be the return rally yet. It's just a little bit of short cover and potentially a move that we can attack later. We had a couple of these little buys that came through on falling magenta, which we know that we wouldn't necessarily care for, nor expected a huge move. This one was a little bit tougher because it was a decent buy as it came in through. It had the resets that you wanted and everything. It's just that as you got the green over, it stayed there, and then by the time it crossed right here was a bar before, but the program can't respond to that that fast, and that's what gave the unfortunate situation where it was on the plus side, but ended up taking the loss. This entry right here was not as necessarily attractive for me. I used it as an opportunity to short into the pop of it and just looked for the earliest sign in that 5K, and that's what resulted in just spectacular move lower. So it's all been good stuff. I don't want to run on too long, but it was quite an exciting end of day prospect with all of this as it continued to decay. So we were very pleased that was so consistent, particularly from a 5K standpoint, other than the end of day, with a little pop. And expect that maybe that's going to have a little bit more before potentially retracing from a 50K, unless the 50K can turn around its readings, which hasn't done so at this particular point. So we go with what is, and what is has been a pretty active and dynamic August, so no objections to it whatsoever. As always, though, if there's something unique or whatever, I will put it up, and if I have the updates to send out for what I've changed for both the Paint 2 as well as for the Power Mode 2 Opus that I've been making adjustments to, I will certainly get them out to you. As always, trade well. We'll talk to you later.